Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. I will be facilitating the workshop today. Next slide, please. Under the 7th iteration of the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, FDA committed to issuing a request for information to elicit public input on methodologic challenges related to patient experience data in other areas of greatest interest or concern to public stakeholders. FDA also issued a summary of the comments received. The input received in response to the RFI helped inform the topics for this public workshop. This workshop, together with that input, will help inform our next workshop. Next slide. We have a full agenda planned for the workshop today. We will start with hearing opening remarks from Dr. Teresa Mullen, Associate Center Director for Strategic Initiatives in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. We will then spend some time hearing from FDA staff members on patient experience data and the role of it throughout the drug development process. We will then move into a panel discussion where FDA staff and industry representatives will talk about submitting patient experience data to FDA as part of a marketing application. After our lunch break, we will have 3 sessions featuring presentations and panel discussions with experts on selected methodologies and the challenges and opportunities they present. We will have a session on Delphi methods, followed by qualitative and embedded interviews, and we'll end with a session focused on when to consider age norm scores and repurposing clinical outcome assessments for new uses. Our panel discussions will have a question and answer portion. You are welcome to submit any questions using the Q&A feature, and we will do our best to get to them. This workshop is being recorded and will be posted online. The slides will be available and closed captioning is being provided. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Teresa Mullen, Associate Center Director for Strategic Initiatives in CDER, to provide opening remarks.
Thank you, Ethan. Good morning, everyone. And we're very happy to have you joining us for this workshop today. And so, yes, I am Teresa Mullen. And so let's go to our next slide, please. So patient-focused drug development, PFDD, considers that patients' perspectives help inform medical product development and decision-making at a number of points, at a number of opportunities, if you will, in drug development, starting as early as the translational phase, where a sponsor is thinking about the target product profile and so on, with questions like, well, what impacts or, the burden of the disease or burden of treatment matter the most to patients? How could you measure them? And in fact, how can you design a product to really try to address those needs, those, if you will, unmet needs for the patient? And moving on from there, for clinical trials, in terms of their operation and conduct, what aspect of clinical trials could be better tailored to meet the needs of patients, to make them less burdensome for patients, to increase enrollment and reduce the people dropping out from trials and so on? And moving on from there, how to collect that information in trials and how to do a better job of collecting and measuring the patient's perspective, for example, via clinical outcome assessments or COAs that could then be submitted for regulatory review and benefit risk assessment, And this area will really be our focus today. And then, but post-market, then also how to best communicate information to patients and prescribers to make sure the medication is used as intended. And so what you're going to be hearing about today is that how much, our reviewers think about the issues here and the quality of what we get and how important it is to include the patient's perspective. And you're going to hear examples of this throughout the day today. Next slide, please. But one of the things we've really come to appreciate very well as we receive more and more patient experience data submissions from various sponsors is that quality is tremendously important. The quality of the collected patient experience data really determines the extent to which it can actually be used to inform regulatory decision-making. And considering the time that patients spend to provide this information and the time that companies spend and invest in collecting it, we really want to make sure that it's done in a way that we can absolutely make the most of it, get the greatest benefit from having that information, and that should inform us about the patient's perspective. And of course, FDA has been working on and developing a series of guidances to really support and improve the quality of these kinds of submissions. Next slide, please. And so in brief, and you'll perhaps hear more about this today, here's that series of guidance that has been developed. The first being collecting comprehensive and representative input from patients to get a good representative crosscut of the population, methods to then identify what is most important to patients, and then building on that, selecting, developing, or modifying fit-for-purpose clinical outcome assessments, and then building on that guidance, incorporating COAs into endpoints for regulatory decision-making. And of course, those last two are the sort of technical guidance that we'll be really focusing more on and discussing today. Next slide, please. And so here I want to basically say that this workshop marks a very exciting milestone for us. I've been involved in patient-focused drug development, I would have to say, from the beginning of it at FDA, and it's been a little bit over 10 years. And here we are. We've done a lot. There have been over 100 patient-focused drug development meetings, most of them externally led by patient organizations, many of them by FDA as well. And that's provided us with tremendous input. And we've been developing these guidances. And so a lot of work's been done. And what we're going to be talking about today really gets to the mechanics of how to collect, how to measure, how to submit this information to FDA to really, so we can use it to the fullest in our decision-making. And I want to close by thanking you for joining us for this workshop today, because your participation here really says something about how much you care about the quality of this information, and that your desire that not just to capture it, but to really make sure you're doing it in a way that makes it possible for it to be used to the fullest extent in regulatory decision-making. And so we're looking forward to the discussions and your questions today. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mullen, for providing these opening remarks. Next slide, please. For our overview of patient experience data session, we will now hear presentations from Robin Bent, Director of Patient-Focused Drug Development in CDER, Dr. Teresa Baracchio, Director of the Office of Neuroscience in CDER, and Dr. Megha Kaushal, Branch Chief of the Benign Hematology Branch in the Center for Biologics Evaluations and Research. I will now turn it over to Ms. Bent.
Great. Thanks so much, Ethan. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you for being here today on Friday the 13th. Next slide, please. As Dr. Mullen mentioned in her presentation, We really have made a lot of progress in incorporating the patient perspective into medical product development, but obviously we still have a way to go. And as we all know, the road may not always be smooth, but we really are lucky because we have a lot of dedicated people working really towards a common goal. Next slide, please. And so we hear a lot of questions about patient experience data. And these questions include when and how should patient experience data be collected and by whom? When and how should patient experience data be used and by whom? And when and how should patient experience data inform regulatory decision-making? And so our goal is to talk about some of this today. Next slide. And as we know, there are a lot of different types of data that fall under the patient experience umbrella. The data can be collected using multiple approaches and can inform multiple aspects of drug development. But one thing that we want to avoid is collecting patient experience data for the sake of collecting patient experience data. Patient experience data should really be collected for a reason, and we should be able to share that reason for collecting the data with the people who are taking the time and effort to provide that information. Ideally, the people collecting the data will also be able to share back how they used it. But so many times when we talk about patient experience data, we talk about clinical outcome assessments, but more and more we're hearing questions about patient experience data beyond clinical outcome assessments. So we're going to try and include that data in discussions today as well. But of course, we understand that people also want to know how FDA uses patient experience data ourselves. And so my colleagues in this session are going to talk a little bit more about how we at FDA consider data and provide a few examples. Next slide, please. And so all of this is to say that, patient experience data is important. And clearly it's important to the 1,200 plus of you who registered for the meeting, which is taking up a full Friday in the middle of December. We know that our panelists have called into prep calls from vacation and are participating in this meeting from around the globe. But also, I just wanted to mention that this is a workshop, and one of the reasons that we have so many of the impressive names on our roster is because we plan to have some really, really good conversations. But since the purpose of this meeting is discussion, I would just want to mention that the information, methods, analyses, and examples included in the Methodologic presentations are provided for discussion purposes only and are not necessarily meant to be considered FDA recommended approaches. Next slide, please. And so as you all have heard and will hear, the voice of the patient and this meeting are really important to us at FDA. We have some great participation in the planning committee, and we have presenters and panelists that represent our clinical reviewers from both the Center for Drugs and the Center for Biologics, our statistical reviewers, including patient-focused statistical scientists, and reviewers from the Division of Clinical Outcome Assessments. Next slide, please. And so as Ethan mentioned earlier, the topics for this meeting were informed by the request for information that we put out last year, as well as by what FDA reviewers identified as important topics based on what we're currently seeing coming into the agency through IND and NDA applications and other discussions. And when we reviewed the comments, we saw that a number of our stakeholders requested greater clarity on how FDA utilizes patient experience data when making regulatory decisions. And so, as I mentioned, many of their comments seemed to focus less on COAs and more on patient experience data that is submitted to inform other areas such as therapeutic context, unmet need, and patients' perspectives on benefit-risk trade-offs. We heard that it would be helpful to address how sponsors who want to discuss the inclusion of patient experience data as part of their drug development program can engage with FDA and how this might fit into the drug development timelines. We received questions about how to format submissions of patient experience data. And we also heard about other challenges, including the need to identify methods of data collection that consider the unique needs of patients and caregivers, particularly those from minority and marginalized communities. We heard about the need to adapt materials to be culturally and linguistically relevant and how to protect personal data. We also received comments regarding the analysis of patient experience data. Some of these comments echoed what we received in the public docket for PFDD guidances 3 and 4, and these comments are being considered as we work to move the guidance documents from draft to final. But we also heard concerns that the emphasis on psychometrics in later PFDD guidance documents may overshadow the relevance of qualitative data and content validity. And you'll see that we're starting to address some of this feedback today. And so, as you recall, this is the first of at least 2 workshops that we will be holding to discuss methodologic challenges. Today, we'll start our discussion focusing on the use and submission of patient experience data, and after lunch, we'll focus more on the methodologies, including both qualitative and quantitative methodologies. Next slide, please. And so, as part of our first panel, participants will discuss submission of patient experience data to FDA and react to the presentations provided by me, Dr. Baracchio, and Dr. Kaushal. We've had robust conversations about the topic of patient experience data and FDA's use with many stakeholder groups, including our colleagues in pharma and bio. We've also heard about some of the challenges that our industry colleagues are facing internally regarding the collection and use of patient experience data. Following some of the discussions that we've had, we've convened an FDA CDER working group to understand some of our internal challenges. One thing that we noted was that the recommendations for how to submit patient experience data, as outlined in the Electronic Common Technical Document, Technical Conformance Guide, may not be well known. For example, when we looked at approved NMEs submitted in fiscal year 24 that contained patient experience data, less than 20% of the applications contained the recommended data table or referenced patient experience data in the reviewer guide. And so often we receive large amounts of patient experience data, and it's unclear how the sponsor intends FDA to use that data. So it may be that we need to do a better job of making the recommendations in the guide known, and perhaps need to make more specific recommendations. Here you can see what the recommendations are. And it's if submitting patient experience data as part of an application for marketing approval, the patient experience data table should be populated and included in the reviewer's guides. Patient experience data, such as clinical outcome assessments collected as part of a clinical trial, should be submitted as part of the relevant clinical trial data. Other patient experience data that is separate from clinical trials should be submitted to section 5.3.5.4. This information was first published in the guide in 2019, and we understand that people are still becoming aware of it and working it into their processes. However, we also realize that this alone may not be the best approach to communicate the information. And so we're going to learn more, hopefully, in some of our discussions today. Also, our discussions on the Delphi method, use of embedded interviews, age norm scores, and repurposing clinical COAs will start important conversations that we feel will be very informative. And so with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to my colleague, Dr. Baracchio. But thank you.
Hi, thank you for allowing me to participate today. I'm going to give a high-level overview of how we incorporate patient experience into our regulatory review. Next slide, please. And this is just a statement that my comments will reflect my perspective working in the Office of Neuroscience. Next slide, please. All right. So FDA engages in a number of different stakeholder engagement activities that help us better understand the patient perspective, and some of these are listed here. And some of these can be useful for industry as well. The patient listening sessions are something that are unique with FDA, where it's a patient advocacy group will typically reach out to FDA to have to share their experience with the FDA. But the patient-focused drug development meetings are more publicly, are public meetings that I'd particularly like to highlight on this list. The externally led patient-focused drug development meetings, or PFDD meetings, allow patients to share their experience with the disease, and ultimate output of that is a voice of the patient report. And these are excellent reference documents that reflect the patient's lived experience with the disease. And FDA does use these documents, and we will refer to these documents during our reviews, and we do cite them in our reviews as well. In the last year, the Office of Neuroscience in particular has participated in several PFDD meetings for Huntington's disease, dementia with Lewy bodies, and autoimmune peripheral neuropathies. There are other types of engagement activities that can also be useful, such as scientific meetings, working groups, public-private partnerships, and research roundtables with reports that can also be leveraged by sponsors to support submissions to the agency. Next slide, please. I do want to emphasize, though, that these stakeholder engagement activities and patient input activities occur throughout the drug development program and are not just limited to the review of a marketing application. Next slide, please. So early in development, engagement with patient communities can begin even before clinical studies are initiated. And this is particularly important in rare diseases where knowledge of the disease may be limited and there are fewer patients, so advanced planning of the development program is critical. But even in more prevalent diseases, it is important to think ahead of what your development program will look like. It is important to consider the tools that will be needed to build a successful development program, which may include assessing the need for natural history studies to better understand the course of the disease, considering whether existing outcomes assessments are appropriate, and it can be a good time to engage with patient communities to assess the feasibility of future trials. Formal meetings with the FDA at this stage typically are pre-IND or interact meetings, and depending on the disease and the focus of the meeting, patient input can provide useful context for discussions of future studies to be conducted under an IND. In the Office of Neuroscience, we have particularly found that external meetings that use a roundtable format that bring a variety of stakeholders together, including patient groups, industry, academia, and regulators, to discuss drug development issues are particularly important because we recognize that we are not the only stakeholder in drug development programs, and we want a number of voices at the table. We have engaged in a number of roundtable meetings for specifically epilepsy, Alzheimer's disease, and frontotemporal dementia. Next slide, please. In the early stages of clinical development, when initial clinical studies have been initiated, the engagement work that I've already mentioned will continue throughout that stage of development. And this is an important time to start considering the qualitative work that may need to be done to support the outcome assessments that may be used in a phase 3 study. And it's already been mentioned several times that there are PFDD guidance series that provides guidance on how to collect input from patients, and particularly guidances 1 and 2 of that series are very useful for a resource for how to collect input from patients on the symptoms and aspects of their disease that are important to them. And again, externally led PFDD meetings can be useful for providing input for considerations regarding benefit and risk, such as what does a clinically meaningful benefit look like, how much risk would a patient be willing to tolerate in order to understand the benefit, and then to the willingness to accept uncertainty within a development program. And reports from meetings or qualitative work can be submitted to support IND submissions or can be incorporated as part of a briefing document to inform discussion with the agency through formal meeting process. Next slide, please. In later stages of development, patient input is particularly important for the final selection of study endpoints that capture concepts that are relevant to patients. And it is also important for sponsors to get patient input on the design of trials, and particularly with considerations regarding patient burden with participation in studies, and to ensure that the study is feasible and to minimize the number of dropouts. Such input is also informative for the agency, as we do give advice to sponsors on the appropriate design of trials that will support a marketing application. And we also need to understand the barriers that sponsors may be facing as they plan to conduct their studies. Next slide, please. The goal of incorporating patient input throughout drug development is so that by the time we receive an application, we have data that is already readily interpretable regarding the meaningfulness of the effects that are observed. Ideally, we will have endpoints that adequately capture important concepts of patient experience and effects that are clinically meaningful. However, that's not always the case. and additional data may need to be submitted to support the meaningfulness of the effects observed. And this is particularly important for our assessment of benefit and risk. But Dr. Kaushal, who will be speaking next, will discuss more specifically about how we consider patient experience data within the review of a marketing application. I'll also just note that if an advisory committee is needed for an application, that patient perspectives are incorporated into that process through patient and consumer representation as voting members on the panel and through the open public hearing process. Next slide, please. Following approval, patient input can still be important to post-marketing development activities for better understanding of the use of the product within the approved indication for efficacy and for ongoing pharmacovigilance. And of course, input would be important for development of any new indications that are being considered. So with that, I will stop and turn it over to Dr. Kaushal, who will be speaking next on how this data is incorporated into marketing application reviews.
Thank you, Dr. Baracchio. Good morning. My name is Megha Kaushal. I'm a pediatric hematologist-oncologist and the benign hematology branch chief in the Office of Therapeutic Products in CBER, or the Center for Biologics. Our office regulates cell and gene therapy products for general medicine, oncology, malignant, and benign hematology products. Next slide, please. So FDA defines patient engagement as activities that involve patient stakeholders sharing their experiences, perspectives, needs, and priorities that help inform FDA's public health mission. Next slide, please. Engaging with patients allows for a better understanding of the impact of disease and its treatment, perspectives about potential and current treatments, views on unmet medical needs and available treatment options, and really enhances the understanding of the disease natural history. Next slide, please. And as Dr. Baracchio has already discussed, patient engagement should really occur throughout the product development process from the pre-IND setting into the BLA or NDA, and even in the post-marketing setting. Next slide, please. So how do we consider patient input? Next slide. So in the Center for Biologics, for our biologic licensing applications, clinical review memos, highlighted here is where this is documented. And once again, as already described, patient experience data includes data that are collected by any persons, including the patients, family members, caregivers of patients, patient advocacy organization, disease research foundations, researchers, and drug manufacturers. And they're really intended to provide information about patients' experiences with the disease or condition, including the impact, including physical and psychosocial impacts of such disease or condition or related therapy on patients' lives, and the patient preferences with respect to the treatment of such disease or condition. Next slide, please. So this leads into the section here where the type of data is submitted in the application. And these include patient-reported outcomes, but also include patient-focused drug development meeting summaries or FDA patient listening sessions. And the reviewer here will see what was submitted and also check here if it was considered for the review. Next slide, please. So I'll now go over a few cases just to give a broad overview of how our office has used patient experience data in our approvals. Next slide, please. So this first one is a cellular therapy indicated for adults with type 1 diabetes. And the patient experience data highlighted in the review included testimonials from subjects who participated in an advisory committee meeting during the review process. This was also included in the review memo and was a collaboration with our Office of Biostatistics and Epidemiology and an academic institution for patient preferences in islet cell therapy and the level of risk that patients were willing to accept. Next slide, please. This biologic is a topical treatment indicated for the treatment of wounds in patients 6 months of age and older with dystrophic epidermolysis bullosa. And here you can see both patient-reported outcome and observer-reported outcomes were used during the clinical trial. Next slide, please. Additionally, data from an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting was used in listening sessions where patients and caregivers share their perspective of the disease including any wound area reduction and pain reduction as important factors. And this was held during the IND process. And once again, efficacy was established on the basis of improved wound healing at different time points. And so this was informative for that decision. Next slide, please. This biologic here is an autologous stem cell-based gene therapy that was approved for the treatment of children with juvenile metachromatic leukodystrophy. And the reviewer used clinician-reported outcomes along with data from an externally led patient-focused drug development, which emphasized the unmet treatment needs and the importance of neurocognitive preservation as a treatment outcome that was also done during the IND stage. And once again, these efficacy outcomes measured both motor and neurocognitive function. And so that patient-focused drug development meeting was extremely informative for this review process. Next slide, please. And lastly, our hemophilia gene therapy files. We gained valuable insight and alignment of our thinking from a public workshop and listening session, which were utilized in our hemophilia gene therapy guidance for this disease, including endpoints, which has now served as the basis for 3 gene therapy approvals for hemophilia A and for hemophilia B. Next slide. So patients really are the experts in what it is like to live with their disease, and patient engagement is the first step in our patient-focused drug development program. And this valuable insight is informative in our review process, and you've seen from the few of the cases from our office, we continue to strive to incorporate this information and aid to inform the regulatory decision. Thank you.
Thank you all for taking the time to provide these presentations. These presentations really captured the diversity of patient experience data and how informative this can be throughout drug development. We will now be moving on to our submissions of patient experience data session. This session will include a panel discussion followed by a Q&A session. Please remember to use the Q&A module in the chat to ask questions. This session will be moderated by Pujita Vaidya, the Director of Regulatory Science and Policy at Sanofi. I will now turn it over to Ms. Vaidya.
Thank you so much, Ethan. So hello, everyone. I am Pujita Vaidya, and I'm happy to be here today to participate in this workshop on a topic that is near and dear to me. I would like to first thank the FDA for inviting me to be part of this important session. And then I'd like to thank the panelists as they turn on their cameras for agreeing to share your insights today. As we've heard from Teresa and others, PFDD initiative kicked off in PDUFA 5. That was over 12 years ago. And we've made great strides by the FDA, industry, academia, patient stakeholders to actively engage patient communities and collect patient experience data to inform medical product development and regulatory decision-making. And personally, I can truly say that we've come a long way since the beginning of PDUFA 5, when I was at FDA trying to figure out what that first PFDD meeting was going to look like. Today, our distinguished panelists will discuss current practices and share considerations on how to overcome challenges in submitting patient experience data as part of the marketing application. The discussion will center around what information should be included in the reviewer's guide and the experiences related to the submission and review of patient experience data. Before we get started, I would like to note that we encourage meeting attendees to please submit your questions into the Q&A box so that we can address some of your questions during the Q&A portion of the meeting at the end. So now I'll move on to our panelists. So we just heard 3 FDA presentations highlighting the importance of patient experience data, the types of patient experience data that can inform the medical product life cycle and regulatory decisions, and finally, examples of how FDA considers patient experience data and includes it in their clinical reviews. I would like to turn to our panelists to introduce themselves and ask each of you to reflect on what you just heard from our FDA presenters and share your initial reactions. So I'll turn it to Leslie first.
Thanks, Pajita. Hi, everyone. I'm Leslie Maloney. I am a global regulatory policy lead with Genentech Roche, and patient-focused drug development is one of my key focus areas. If I reflect on what we've just heard, I think it is clear the commitment FDA has to incorporation of the patient voice in drug development. And that is something that is echoed by us at Genentech, where we remain deeply committed to this topic, to integration of patient centricity in all that we do and the various decision points. There are a variety of things that, I'd like to discuss through this next panel, but of where we're seeing reviewers put kind of as they look at and use this data as part of their decision making. You can see it in the PED table, but there are opportunities for improvement and clarity and consistency and how that's communicated. And there's also opportunities I think we have as sponsors in the industry to be better on our side of how we're communicating why we collected certain data and how we think FDA should use it. So looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Leslie. I'll move on to Nikki. Okay, well, as Nikki tries to come on, I'll move it to David, please.
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is David Reasoner. I'm in the Division of Clinical Outcome Assessment and participating in the panel from the perspective of a COA reviewer who might experience the submission of patient data as part of either an IND meeting package or potentially during the evaluation review of an NDA or BLA.
Thanks, David. Monica?
Hi, I'm Monica Morell, a senior statistician and psychometrician in the Cedar Office of Biostatistics. I really appreciated the presentations earlier and liked how they highlighted the different ways that patient experience data are collected and incorporated throughout the development program of different products. I look forward to discussing this further during the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. Rosa?
Sorry. So good morning. I'm Rosa Sharafat. I'm the branch chief in General Medicine Branch 2 in the Office of Therapeutic Products in CBER Center for Biologics at FDA. So our office is reviews the cellular and gene therapies applications for neurological and ophthalmology indications. And as a member of the clinical review team, we are definitely committed to and value the importance of the patient experience data in the process of the review, and specifically towards the review of the biologic license application. We do incorporate the patient data in our review, and as it was presented by Dr. Kaushal, there are several different modalities that the patient experience data can be incorporated through the collection of data from the clinical outcome assessments, patient-reported outcomes, or caregiver-reported outcomes, clinician-reported outcomes, as well as formats of different meetings, such as patient listening sessions and PFDD sessions. I'd be looking forward to the discussions and questions for the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosa. Aliza?
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Aliza Thompson, and I am the acting director of the Division of Cardiology and Nephrology. It's really a pleasure to be with everyone today. As noted by Teresa and by others, obviously patient input needs to inform our drug development programs, and obviously also needs to inform FDA's review of marketing applications. And so very much look forward to the discussion we'll have later about how our reviewers look at the data. I think for the most part, I'm going to make comments about patient experience data that are not related to sort of clinical outcome assessments, but other types of patient experience data. But very much look forward to the panel discussion.
Great, thank you. And finally, Nikki.
Hi, yeah, thanks very much for your patience. I don't know what happened with my camera, but I appreciate the opportunity to participate today, and thank you to the FDA for facilitating this workshop. I think the topic is really important, and patient experience data are one of those things where I think we all know it's important, but we don't always have a common understanding of what it is, how to use it, how it is used, and how to submit it. I just have a couple comments on the earlier session where I think, well, I appreciate highlighting the importance of patient experience data in a submission, and how, and sponsors being careful to identify them not only as patient experience data, but how they're meant to be considered by FDA to facilitate review. I have heard about these large tomes of data being submitted as these sort of standalone dossiers, and recognize the frustration and the inability to really review those in a meaningful way, but also the effort it would take to put all of those data together. I do think that more examples, and I hope this comes out in the discussion, of how we can include data, especially when we think about qualitative data, maybe from in trials or even collected as concept elicitation data that maybe supports clinical outcome assessment and included in the dossier, how those data can be inserted or referenced in other parts of the application, perhaps in the CSR, to facilitate review where it might help interpret other endpoints or further understand the patient perspective of the unmet treatment need.
Great, thank you, Nikki. Yes, we will definitely dive into all of the points that we all have mentioned. Great. So first, we've heard examples presented by FDA on how PED can inform regulatory decision making. And I'd like to now turn to our industry panelists first to briefly share how you as sponsors use PED that is collected, and as appropriate, how is that submitted to the FDA? So I'll turn it to Leslie first.
Thank you. We all understand patient inclusivity is about measuring what matters to patient, not making assumptions about what patients want or need. And in order to measure what matters, we first got to talk to them and really seek to understand that lived experience of the disease. So at Genentech, this starts very, very early, preclinical, and kind of as their first FDA said, it is something that we do across the spectrum of medical development. And it's not a one-time conversation, and it's not intended just because it's going to be submitted to FDA. It's because it is critical in informing the direction of our drug development and making these interim decisions across that spectrum. We use a variety of qualitative, quantitative, and mixed approaches to collect and use this patient experience data internally, and that is helping us to identify, develop, and validate endpoints for our trials, informing the design and protocols in our clinical trials, as well as part of the evidence necessary for the benefit risk assessment of the drug. Now, we're active in external collaborations, looking at the consensus needing to be built around these different methodologies and tools, investing in new technologies and innovations such as digital health technology that is helping to measure and obtain patient-generated data in ways it couldn't before, and even making accessible data that we didn't have before. We're also using patient experience data to inform different modes of administration. As we hear more and more about moving care into the patient's home, how do we move from IV to subcutaneous formulations, allowing patients to receive their treatment in their homes as opposed to the clinic? So while that may not be a major clinical benefit, it does have a major impact for patients. So that's some of that patient experience data that we're collecting and using, and again, informing the types of formulations we're going to be developing and the types of treatments as well. In addition, we're using patient experience data to help guide our efforts to increase the diversity of our trials, such as providing transportation or childcare and providing culturally appropriate patient education materials. So we invest in patients and patient experience data because it's the right thing to do, not because it's recommended or mandated. It's just central to who we are as a company. And integration of patient centricity and the science are fundamental because at Genentech and Roche, we talk about not just bringing medicines to patients, but transformative medicines. So in order to have medicines that transform lives, it really has to be something that is meaningful to the disease, meaningful to the patients, and that's why it starts very early on and continues throughout the spectrum of development.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I'll turn it to Nikki now to talk about how you have kind of seen patient experience data incorporated overall, and how's it collected, and touch a little bit about a point that you made earlier about the qualitative data as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Fujita. I've seen it used quite a few different ways, and I would say too, not all patient experience data that are collected and included in the drug development or medical product development process make it to the FDA or make it to any external stakeholder, right? So we have all of these internal benchmarks and internal meetings to decide go, no go, and the patient experience data are crucial to those. And I think, I consider is it important, the reason we collect these high quality data, we don't want to continue developing something that doesn't work. And then we don't want to kill something that does work, right? That patients could use. And so the higher quality these data are, and the more we understand the patient perspective of efficacy and patient preference around treatment and tolerability, the better off we are able to make those decisions internally. Again, the definition of patient experience data does really matter. I think there's a lot of qualitative data collected, especially at the sort of indication or disease state level, not necessarily within one specific drug development program. And sometimes these are collected as part of market research, right? And then the question almost always comes up of, well, can't we use these qualitative data in our application? Do we have to collect the qualitative data using these different methodologies, or what can be used and what can't be used? And how do we know the data are of the right quality? And then, another way that we use them more and more is really around the tolerability aspect. I think we focus a lot on efficacy, as we should, but I think the more targeted we get with treatment and the more personalized medicine becomes important. I think it's really important to understand what are the tolerability issues, and different patients have different and different participants have different levels of willingness to take on different side effects.
Great, thank you, Nikki. I do a point that both Nikki, you and Leslie brought up, and I want to kind of dive a little bit deeper in this around the qualitative patient experience data. We've heard from the presentations, and you all have also talked about the various types of patient experience data and how that informs internal decision-making and also regulatory decision-making. And as you highlighted, a lot of times sponsors do conduct these qualitative interviews, focus groups, various market research to understand the patient perspectives, either through patient ad boards, panels, which are very similar to, in some senses, to PFDD meetings, but on a smaller scale, to really understand the unmet need to inform internal discussions. But as you mentioned, a lot of times some of that can also inform regulatory decision-making if it is something around, informing the therapeutic context, or what the unmet need or symptoms that are most bothersome to patients that can inform benefit risk assessment. Now, all of this may not necessarily always go through your IRB process, right, early on. And I think that's one of the reasons why there are these challenges of trying to figure out, can this be submitted? Can it not be submitted to the FDA? So I do have a question. I think typically, are you my industry panelists, are you submitting or trying to submit this type of data, or have you tried And then I would love to hear reactions from our FDA colleagues as well about, what should we be doing with that type of data that could potentially inform overall like therapeutic contracts that goes into the benefit risk thinking. So I'll turn it to my industry colleagues first and then FDA. Thank you.
I can go ahead and start. So I'll share a success story from the Genentech Roche perspective, and that was in the disease area of spinal muscular atrophy. So the molecule we have there is Evrysdi. And this was around using kind of that non-COA patient experience data to support a priority review designation. This success, let me start out, was only possible due to very early and consistent patient engagement and collaboration with patient advocacy groups, as well as very early discussions with FDA reviewers. So SMA, or spinal muscular atrophy, is a rare autosomal recessive neuromuscular disease that's characterized by slow progressive muscle weakness and atrophy of the skeletal muscles. It's usually diagnosed in infancy and continues throughout childhood and into adulthood, with condition worsening over time. So we sought approval of a new therapeutic option in SMA and wanted to expedite patient access through priority review. And therefore, we needed to demonstrate the continued presence of unmet medical need from the patient perspective because there were treatments already available on the market. So we collaborated very early on with Cure SMA and the SMA Foundation to advance our understanding of that existing unmet need and what treatment effects were most relevant to them. So this data helped prepare for our interactions with FDA and other global health authorities. It supported these various regulatory designations and informed our submission documents. Some of the data we collected were patient views, statements, and published data from these patient advocacy group-led surveys, such as Voice of the Patient reports. It was included in our regulatory application to capture, again, that unmet need and real-life value that SMA treatments can bring to help support the regulatory review decisions or the review where possible. Members of the SMA Foundation attended meetings alongside us, providing insights from the people who were living with SMA directly. And this also led to, some of the evidence generation activities we took on to further highlight the importance of stabilization and the clinically meaningful changes for patients with SMA related to motor function measures, including the preservation of function. So that was qualitative and quantitative data that helped identify that just not losing additional function was something that was clinically meaningful. And that we also wanted to capture patient preference related to terms of the mode of administration. Subsequent to our initial application to FDA, and at their request, we submitted some of this qualitative data on those patient perspectives with the existing treatments that existed. This data, combined with literature evidence and clinical expert data, was essential to demonstrate that unmet medical need and support the priority review designation. So our learnings from that included really explicitly acknowledging when patient experience data is going to inform the regulatory decisions beyond approval. That was an approval decision. It was helping get that priority review designation, describing clearly in our own internal strategy where there were gaps and where patient experience data could help address those gaps, talking with the reviewers to say what types of data would help support this unmet medical need. So again, it was a collaboration in that sense with FDA and the reviewers to know what data and then how it could be presented to them, and continuing to engage with those patient advocacy groups. This case study is an example where we had, as I mentioned, a clear strategy and direction and very early interactions with FDA, telling them how we were going to collect the data and how we thought they needed to use it. That is not always the case for all of our drug development programs. And that's an area where, as I mentioned before, there are opportunities for us as an industry to improve. We know we're collecting the data. We know for some of these, again, whether it's unmet need or other uses of the non-COA data, how we'd like FDA to do it, but we aren't as directive probably as we should. And that's an area of opportunity when we talk about templates or frameworks that FDA or industry or even a public-private partnership could be in crafting. How do we better tell that story about why we collected the data and how we think FDA needs to use it?
Thanks so much, Leslie. Nikki, I know you had come off mute earlier. Would you like to add?
Yeah, just briefly, I would add that one, I don't think we're systematic enough at the outset of how we're collecting patient experience data when we do it in the process of drug development. I will say that in trial interviews can pose an especially difficult conundrum when we're looking at how do we package it appropriately for review. And I have had an experience where in a rare disease, we thought it was very important to have these in-trial interview data, the qualitative data, reviewed along with the endpoint data. And we came to agreement with FDA ahead of time to determine where in the CSR we would summarize and then reference different parts of the qualitative report, which I'm hoping sort of facilitates the review at the right time by the right people, as opposed to attaching a full report at the very back of an application.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Leslie and Nikki. And I'll turn it to my FDA colleagues to perhaps react to some of this, to think about, the types of, Leslie gave a great, successful case example. Nikki's also talking about, this qualitative data. We need to be systematic, but, what do we do with some of this like data that we have, but we don't necessarily know how to package it. Like from the FDA perspective, when we're talking about these other types of patient experience data that are not clinical outcomes assessment, how is it clear to the FDA when it is submitted, how that should be interpreted? And do you have any considerations for us, for everyone to take back to think about how that type of qualitative data could be submitted to the agency? So I'll turn to my FDA colleagues, whoever would like to kick off the conversation.
Yeah, and this is Eliza, and maybe I'll start. And I think, as you've heard, patient experience data is, critical for, informing the design of these programs, and also that it can be collected with sort of a range of rigor, right? And I think that part of it is, when you think about what's submitted to FDA and what you frankly even need to submit to FDA, I think that's an important consideration is sort of how critical these data are going to be. And again, I'm speaking about non-COA data in terms of really helping us understand either the unmet need and or, tolerance for risk, right? And so to the extent that it's really going to be critical for your application in terms of because the drug has a particular toxicity, or you're trying to make a case that you're really addressing an unmet need, you're going the accelerated approval route, and it's critical that you establish that you're providing some meaningful benefit over available therapies, then obviously, you need to, there are going to be rigorous discussions about the nature of those data and how you sort of what you're going to provide, or at least hopefully during the IND phase, and it'll come in and with sufficient detail, which all will agree on. I think on the other end of the spectrum is perhaps what Nikki noted, right? Like some of this is critical work that informs the design of these drug development programs, that informs the design of trials, but probably not collected in such a rigorous way. And I think, just sort of, I think what we would hope that when sponsors submit patient experience data to us, they don't just throw everything at us, that they really think about the rigor with which the data were collected. And then also, make sure that it's fit for purpose from their perspective in terms of speaking to sort of an issue, unmet need, tolerance for risk, these other things. I'll just throw in as well, in terms of our reviewers, and I can't remember who said this, but, someone early on acknowledged that, essentially when we get these marketing applications, I can't even tell you how many pages there are as part of them. I'm sure industry knows as well that they're just massive. And obviously someone can't actually read through them all. And so I would say the first thing in terms of, what's helpful for reviewers is, first of all, tell us when you submitted this information, right? Because sometimes you don't even tell us, and it's sort of, we discover it as sort of looking for something else. But the other sort of critical aspects of this, and again, others have noted this, is, if you submitted it, tell us why you submitted it to us, why you think it will help inform our decision making, please also tell us, because again, as noted, sometimes you collect this information and it's meant for someone else. If you in fact intended to collect this, but it was collected for someone else, let us know that as well, because it will really help ensure that we focus on the critical patient experience data that you submit, and obviously don't pay attention to things that you didn't think was that you don't think are that important for your application. And in the end, we may conclude the same.
Great, thank you so much, Eliza. And you brought up a good point, the need for that level of rigor, fit for purpose. And at the end of the day, I think as part on the sponsor side, is really trying to think about, are we submitting it? Are we communicating that with the FDA? And then do we have a clear purpose for submitting that? And is that being communicated of why we're submitting that that type of data? And I'll come back to that after this conversation about how that all of this should be submitted. But I'll turn it over to David next.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to amplify those points a little bit. I mean, firstly, I think we'd be interested in knowing how you're using the data and how that's directing your development program, because it would give us some insight when we receive either, for instance, it could be a COA dossier, it could be a patient experience data dossier. These may be significantly large pieces of the ECTD, thousands of pages. And I think to get the best value out of our evaluation review, guidance as to what conclusions or what insights you're trying to support would be helpful. And so I think Nikki's example, where some of these things were pulled into more primary documents and then sort of signpost for the review team, I think is a reasonable approach. And I will say that it can be a delay in actually getting to the content of a file if your first hours are spent on navigability and honestly just wondering what's most important to evaluate and such a substantial document. Thanks.
Great, thank you, David. Yep, Marissa.
Yeah, so great discussions, all of the points that were raised, and again from the review team's perspective, when the application is submitted, like a broad overview, general overview of the intention for the data that is submitted, a summary for in the reviewer's guide or the cover letter for the review team, that like what was the purpose of submitting this part of the patient experience data in the application. That would be really helpful for us. And one other point that was also discussed is like so collecting this data is throughout the whole duration of the program development. Thinking about this planning ahead proactively from the beginning of the product development and communication with the review team at different stages of the development, and like kind of having that collaborative communication that would really be helpful for the review team. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosa. So all three of you have brought up really good points about, making it clear what the intention is, why we're submitting it. Now, getting to the point about, I think Rosa, you've sort of starting to tee this up about how can that be done, right? Indicating it in the cover letter. There is the ECTD conformance guide where FDA asks for the patient experience data table to actually be included in our submission and the sponsor's submission as well as part of the marketing application. And in that, I guess one thing I would like to ask is, to what extent what would you like to see in that, right? Would you like sponsors to indicate, what has been submitted? Would that include, what the intent is, where it is discussed further in the massive dossier? Like what is some of the details that would be most useful for you for industry to include in that table when it is part of the application? And then just an add-on to that is, is there an opportunity, or would it be useful to actually indicate it in other venues as well, other areas, like in a meeting prior, you know, before we even submit our dossier? Is there an opportunity to kind of flag that for the review team? So I'd like to ask my FDA colleagues.
Sure. So I'll try first. So yeah, all of the above that you mentioned, those are all important points that kind of cross-referencing the module that the data is submitted under, that obviously would be very helpful, but also that discussion of the purpose or that brief summary of the purpose of this data. Leslie had an excellent example of like how that would help with the or guide the decision making. Yeah, those are the things that comes to mind. So and communication, as I mentioned, is the key that one other venue actually that can patient experience data be addressed at is like at the beginning of the submission, we have this application orientation meeting that is a presentation of the whole the entire submission. So that would be another opportunity to highlight the patient experience data and the purpose.
Great, thank you so much, Rosa.
And maybe I'll just add that I know at least one of my go-tos is always the reviewer's guide. When I am really quickly trying to find things and that I think are critical for an application, I really rely on the reviewer's guide because, you know, often the reviewer's guide is used to sort of address issues that have been discussed during development or other things. So would encourage people to think about using the reviewer's guide to sort of say, hi, this is where we've submitted what we think is really important, you know, patient experience data, and, you know, and this was the intent of the data. You know, I think the extent to which you discuss the submission of patient experience data and where it will be before an application comes in, I think it really depends, you know, hinges on, is this critical for your application or not? And I don't mean to, it's not in any way meant to suggest that patient experience isn't important for all our applications. It is, but for some applications, you know, it's not really the patient experience data that's the critical piece here that's going to, you know, be a part of, you know, the concern with the development program. Or, you know, sometimes we're in a setting of a common disease, you know, well-used pathway and outcomes are hard. And yeah, things are sometimes a little bit, yeah, already very well understood, for lack of a better term.
Great, thank you. I'll open it up to anyone else. Does anyone else have any thoughts or comments that they'd like to add on this particular topic around, you know, how can we do a better job of, you know, flagging for the agency that this is being submitted? Or also, just to add to that, is there an opportunity, and this gets to sort of your point, Nikki, about, you know, we submit a evidence dossier. It's submitted there. There's qualitative work, there's concept elicitation, early qualitative work that's included as part of the dossier. But if we want others, flag it for others as well, other non-COA reviewers and others to review it, how can that be done, right? We can indicate it in the submission somewhere, or is there an opportunity? Can we do a better job of integrating the relevant pieces, relevant patient experience data into the necessary areas where we see it sort of impacting that particular decision? Let's say if it's unmet medical need, or talking about the current treatment options or benefit. But I'd like to turn this to the panelists, maybe Nikki, Leslie, others, if you have thoughts on this, if you'd like to share.
Yeah, I would like to. And I think I would say we don't do a great, as I can't speak for the full industry, I don't think we do a great job of that, right? Once it's submitted as the COA dossier, it becomes the COA dossier, and that is kind of the end in itself. And I don't know that we do a great job of thinking beyond that. And then there might be an assumption made that it's being included in benefit risk decision making or being included in the review. And maybe it is, and maybe it's not. One related question, I don't want to take us off topic, is, we talk a lot about the rigor, the quality of data and the rigor of data collection, but with qualitative data, the analysis, becomes really important, because if you're reading these summaries and qualitative data analysis just is very difficult to replicate, right? Like where, if I submit a SAS data set, you could rerun the data or run your own and see if you get the same conclusions. I think it's much more difficult to do that with qualitative data. So when we are submitting, I think as sponsors, we want to be very careful to be as transparent as possible. So while I don't want you to read 1,000 pages of transcripts, I also don't want you to think that I'm somehow cherry picking the pieces of the qualitative data that are going to make my application look better. And I know that, David, the DCOA, there's a lot of expertise in qualitative data analysis, and we get a lot of great feedback and review, but that does sometimes lead to a little bit of, well, I would like this qualitative data to be considered by the review division, but how comfortable is the review division in saying, I really trust this report, or I trust these analyses because it is qualitative, and that isn't as intuitively, quote unquote objective. I think numbers make us feel more comfortable sometimes.
Thank you, Nikki. Do any of my FDA colleagues would like to speak to that a little?
Sure, I'd like to address that a little bit, and I'm not sure these comments are entirely limited to patient experience data. And of course, Division of Clinical Outcome Assessment spends a lot of time with clinical outcome assessments. That's one form of data that we're interested in talking about. My experience is it runs the gamut from just a statement by fiat without any supportive evidence or links. And I think keeping in mind this is an ECTD, and it is easy to collate relevant material on a topic from maybe multiple places in your CDD structure. We've done research over years. There are reports in various places. So for instance, at the risk of making a bad example on the fly, someone mentioned most bothersome symptom, and that's an interesting topic. And you may have evidence in several places about why that would be a relevant endpoint to propose in your program. So it may have come out of certain qualitative interviews, there may be literature. I doubt you're going to have a standalone report on the topic. So if you had a standalone section in which you explain what motivated you to make the proposal, and in turn link to those pieces of evidence that were important in your thinking, they probably are going to be important in our thinking. So my suggestion would be to keep in mind that it's a virtual document, and create a place where you're explicitly explaining your thinking behind the proposal and pulling together those pieces. And I think at that level, I wouldn't worry about cherry picking, right? Because you're trying to tell a story, you're seeing something important, something hypothesis generating in your data. And I think, we would be receptive to that. And then, from a more formal review perspective, we would be looking at the way you've summarized your qualitative data to see if it seemed fair and balanced. And of course, it's unlikely we have the capacity to read all of your transcripts. So, we're looking at how you coded things and the judgments you made and the examples you tabulated, et cetera, and trying to learn the file. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Any other final thoughts from any of my FDA colleagues? Okay. So just shifting gears a little bit. So we've been talking a lot about patient experience data and how that should be submitted to the FDA, what sponsors can do to communicate that better and be transparent, and how, what the FDA would like to see in that space. Now I'd like to turn it to my FDA colleagues to sort of to talk about, when it comes to review of patient experience data, what are some of the challenges that you see in reviewing the data that is being submitted as part of the marketing application. And with that, could you share some considerations on how we could potentially overcome some of these challenges that you're seeing?
I could get it started. So one challenge definitely is having insufficient or sometimes poorly documented information on how COA data were collected, or also on how COA scores have been calculated. Another challenge that we see is the occasional submission of COA daily diary data that are collected using paper diaries, for example, instead of electronic data capture. We have encountered challenges related to the use of paper diary collection. So traceability, completeness, and consistency of data is important for the verification of the administration and scoring of COAs that have been administered in clinical trials and used for corresponding endpoints. And part of the COA score verification process is the replication of COA scores that are used in efficacy analysis. So the agency's score replication process involves trying to reconstruct the COA scores that are evaluated in the efficacy analysis from raw response data and other relevant clinical information in accordance with official manuals and scoring algorithms that exist for these COA measures. Successful score replication indicates that there's sufficient traceability from the collected response data to the endpoint COA score computation and apparent fidelity to the official administration and scoring procedures for those COAs. This process really necessitates that sponsors provide FDA clear and sufficiently detailed scoring algorithms, but also explanations of flags relevant that are in the submitted data sets. The agency really needs to understand which values in the raw data are intended to be included in the efficacy score calculations and which ones are intended to be excluded. When the COAs that we're talking about are especially complex, for example, the evaluation of cognition in pediatric patients, this clear documentation of the COA administration procedures and detailed explanations for flags in data sets are really paramount to our ability to replicate the COA scores. So we encourage early and frequent engagement with the agency on plans to capture the COA data itself, but also that supportive data that's ultimately going to aid in our ability to verify the COA scores. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Monica. Do any of our other panelists have anything they'd like to add regarding some of the challenges? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So just to add to what Monica just mentioned. So in terms of the quality of the data that is being submitted, so one example I can provide is like sometimes, especially for neurodevelopmental outcomes in pediatric patients, there might be videos submitted which basically for assessment of milestones, developmental milestones, and it's extremely important that these data be collected in a standardized way. That since we are looking at the data longitudinally over time, that comparison and that continuity can be interpretable, and so that's the kind of making sure that it's collected in a standardized way and with the intention to collect it longitudinally. For a lot of our products, also the durability of the effects are important, and so that kind of in terms of the quality of the data, keeping that in mind. So that was the point that I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosa. Any of my industry colleagues would like to share anything? or react?
I think I'm curious, Monica, what your thoughts are on alternative scoring algorithms, whether that's for sensitivity analyses or just to use, because it's a different context of use, we want to score it a different way and interpret it a different way. Obviously, that's a discussion we should start early and build the evidence around and not surprise you with that right at the right when we turn in the application. But do you have any recommendations there around what you're looking for if we administer the clinical outcome assessment in the way that it's meant to be, but we are scoring it differently? What kinds of evidence do you expect to see?
Sure. So definitely in line with what we've been talking about today, it's really important that the objective of your use of this alternative algorithm is clear. What is it that you're trying to get from this other algorithm that is maybe not evident from the first algorithm that we're talking about? It's really the purpose of alternative scoring is what will help us provide guidance in the specific context of use. So like you said, just coming to us early, that would be the best way to develop a plan together.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I think it's really thinking about, this issue of traceability, completeness, replicability, interpretability, right? As Rosa, you were talking about it, needing and thinking about the quality of data overall and what can we do to support that all that is appropriately shared, submitted, and discussed early on with the agency is critical. Just thinking about review challenges, perhaps, I think you've hit on a lot of these, the data, the level of rigor that's necessary in the data that's submitted. One of the things I know from the communication standpoint, we focused a lot around how we as sponsors, industry, can do a better job of clearly communicating what we're submitting, how that's being submitted, and what the intent is. One of the challenges that I often hear on the industry side is, and the presentations covered to some of that, is like, how is FDA considering this data? At the end of the day, we're sharing all of this data. How is FDA considering that? And are there opportunities? And I'd love to hear from, maybe start with my industry colleagues. Are there opportunities? Is there something that from the industry side that would be critical for us to understand a little bit better? Early on, there were great examples of, I think most of them were CBER examples of where their interlink has been made, where externally led PFDD meetings, patient listening sessions, and others, and kind of including that in the patient experience data section of the review regarding how it was considered. But I just want to turn to my industry colleagues to see if there are any thoughts on that, on what we would like, we as industry may want to see, and others as well, not just industry, other stakeholders, patient stakeholders, and others on how FDA is considering this data.
Yeah, I would say, when we're submitting it, even if we point and draw the perfect map and explain our thought process, we know what we think is important from an industry perspective, but at the end of the review, we don't always know what was considered important, what was kind of a deal breaker, what really made a difference and really influenced a decision, and what was kind of a nice to have. And there are a couple of reasons that's helpful. One is so we can submit better applications, but two, just very practically, internally fighting for funds to conduct this research, there's one pot of money. And if we can't explain concisely exactly how the data are used and the impact it may have on an application, it can be more and more difficult to get approval to conduct these studies sometimes. So I think if there were a way to say not only what has been considered, but kind of the level of importance that it had in decision making would be really helpful.
I would like to highly emphasize what you just said, Nikki. I think that is a consistent message across industry for the prioritization of this work and the importance of we are taking patient time and energy and want that data and what we hear them telling us as part of the various conversations we have along drug development. We want FDA to hear what we are hearing from patients and to know what good looks like. That is something I think as I talk with industry colleagues, there's still a lack of clarity of what does good look like. We heard from Teresa earlier about we need quality data, but everyone seems to kind of think of that differently. So that clear communication from FDA in the review summaries about how the COA and patient experience data inform the benefit risk assessment is, goal number one. Whether that is, through completion of the PED table and not only saying like why you used it, of a qualitative patient survey was submitted and that data informed FDA's decision about XYZ, like something as clear, black and white as that would be really important, because as you said, Nikki, it is not only like what is used, but why something was or wasn't used, and not just for us internally as a company to be able to pass that on to our next study team that's going to, in either that disease area or the next one, to say, this is the recipe for how you move this forward. This is how you need to engage with FDA, when and why. This is how you develop the data for our own internal best practices. But I think there is just such interest from industry and from patient advocacy groups in furthering this science, furthering this work. And we aren't able, without like a repository and best practices and use cases from each other, or what we're able to detect from those review summaries, the learning itself, the regulatory science can be stifled. And that's not in anyone's best interest. So are there opportunities not only for the clearer, transparent communication, I should say consistency across review divisions, which is hard, of how they're using it, what good looks like, so that we can continue to, as you said, Nikki, improve our own applications, improve our own data collection, but making sure that all of that time and effort from the patients and providing it is well utilized as well. So if we're collecting data that at the end of the day, FDA is like, nah, I didn't really need that. How can we better know that so we don't go back to that well and keep doing things that at the end of the day aren't being used for that benefit risk assessment or some of these other non-COA related discussions?
Thank you, Leslie and Nikki. Any final thoughts from my FDA colleagues, or anyone would like to add anything?
Well, maybe just to note that, and all have noted this, that there can be really a range in terms of the rigor at which this data are collected. And so I would assume, Leslie and Nikki, when you talk about, trying to understand how FDA thinks about it, hopefully we're focused really on the data that were collected with more rigor, understanding they're not, the COA, endpoint. And I think, obviously, or not obviously, but we just encourage you to consider asking, right? I mean, for some of our development programs or marketing applications, we have, periodic meetings with sponsors during the review of the application for new molecular entities. So, it's an opportunity for you to get, real-time feedback. But even after, the marketing application, the decision has been made, certainly you can send an email to a project manager. Sometimes we even have meetings as well to get feedback. So, ask us if something was critical to your application. Obviously we'll try to do a better job of documenting, but again, there's all, we are often looking at a number of issues in our applications and try to succinctly summarize our conclusions on things. And so I think sometimes, people can put a line in which accurately reflects sort of how we, how the importance of it. But maybe that line is not enough for you to fully understand all the issues. So yeah, just ask.
Thank you, Lisa. All right. So we have, and first of all, we have active audience, so that is great. And we have received many questions from the audience. So slowly I'll sort of shift gears and go through some of these questions and ask the panelists to respond to that. So the first question I have here is, it is for my industry colleagues on the panel. So from an organizational process perspective, are you seeing collaboration between your company's HEOR teams, who normally do not have an FDA focus for their work, and the clinical research teams who are heavily FDA focused to generate evidence for PFDD, particularly for unmet need, patient preferences, and burden of disease? So I'll turn it to Nikki and Leslie to see if you have any thoughts on this.
I can start. Recently, we had an internal workshop because we recognized, like, what is our current state? How do we continue to advance and learn ourselves? What could we be doing better? For all the things we may ask of health authorities to do better, we can do things better ourselves. And so we had our folks from our patient-centered outcomes research, we had our global patient partnership folks, and then talking with folks in regulatory and then the study teams to say, how do we do this currently? Who else should we be talking to? What are our aspirations and goals for what the landscape in patient centricity needs to look like? How do we get these study teams to, prioritize, to making sure we're having strategies kind of end to end from the evidence generation side? So we are trying to do a better job where we have pockets across our company that are doing this work. How do we continue to build a more systematic approach internally to recognize and really advance the space? So to the question of, like, yes, we do talk to it. We could be more consistent in how we do it. And we recognize that and want to start thinking through what are organizational processes, SOPs, or other things in order for us to do this better.
Thank you, Leslie. Nikki.
Yeah, I would echo quite a bit of that. I mean, at my time at Lilly and then at Johnson & Johnson, and then now that I'm at Open Health Group working with a number of different companies, a number of different sponsors, I will say, if you've seen one process, you've seen one process, and the way that these groups work together. And it can even differ within a company widely. And a lot of it is cultural, and a lot of it is a person, you don't know an organization. It's not always systematic that we include a representative from this function, this function, this function. It's, I know that Nikki knows COA, and I know that Leslie is really good at, regulatory, and David is a really great statistician, so I'm going to put them in a room. And so I think that it does need to be more systematic if we're going to get better at pushing it forward. I think some HEOR teams actually do have a heavy FDA focus, some don't. I have seen it work really well. It just tends to be more serendipitous than by design. And I'd like to see it more by design. So.
Great. Thank you, Leslie and Nikki. And I can just chime in. That's both of your comments resonated with what I've seen in the various companies that I've been at as well. But I think we try, but there isn't a standardized way that we do that, and always follow it. Great. So I have another question here from the audience. So our speakers have oriented their examples of patient experience data toward treatment response, so efficacy and tolerability. Could you also address the value of patient experience data focused on the burden of disease and symptoms for those not on therapy? Do you have thoughts or experiences with this, or collecting this type of data?
Well,
have you seen that? Yeah, go ahead, Rosa.
Yeah, so actually one example that comes to mind is our center had just a very recent, as of last week, we had a patient listening session that basically it was the voice of patients and caregivers regarding early participations in the clinical trials for gene therapies in the context of the rare diseases. So I think in the context of the disease burden or the trial participation burden, patient listening sessions are a good example of how we can incorporate the patient experience data in our review, and definitely we do value that and consider that in our review.
Great, thank you, Rosa. Any other
just gonna add that I think it really speaks to the seriousness of the disease. And certainly when we're, you're in a rare disease setting where, we don't necessarily, we're not the experts in the disease. Maybe, even though we have reviewers who are cardiologists or nephrologists, they haven't seen a lot of patients with these diseases. It can be really critical for us in terms of understanding the impact on the day-to-day life, of what it means. And I think that very much, when we understand the seriousness of the disease, unmet need, that can very much shape our thinking in terms of, when we look at the data as a whole from a development program.
Great.
And from the perspective of a COA reviewer, I would say that we do look at those data. In fact, this sort of ties back to our earlier conversation about what gets looked at and how does it get used. So we use those data to provide some context to the structured data. And Nikki was advocating for more structure, more organized data collection early, but that's still within the development program phase. So I think that, where you have patient advocacy groups generating early data in a pre-competitive space, that may be less structured in the sense of a drug developer, but still useful from our perspective in terms of understanding the context of your program and what may have influenced your decisions. Like, you didn't just arrive at your qualitative research study design from a blank piece of paper, right? You've probably engaged over years the patient community and potentially have done your own non-IND research. So I think, bringing all that context into the patient experience data that you submit, those are resources. If you link to them so we can find them and you tell us why they're important, those are resources that we can use, and we do. But the label's a bit like the tip of the iceberg. So there's one sentence that gets discussed very much in the label. There's a huge ECTD that many people spent months of their lives evaluating, and then ultimately the research that supported those reports, as many years of your life contributing, to the patient outcomes in terms of your drug development program. So it's a huge iceberg, and it may be a little hard to tell how much the iceberg we traversed, but I think it's good to know, I think, that we do look at those resources, and those provide important context. I mean, if I were at a company, they might be hypothesis generating for how I might want to first do my concept elicitation, or how I might want to first put my Delphi panel together, for instance. But I think at the end of the day, when it's all packaged up, we do need some signposts, to traverse the iceberg.
Great, thank you so much. Yep, go ahead, Nikki. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a question. We're talking a lot about patient experience data and the different types of data, and I have special interest in performance outcome assessments. And I'm curious to hear, especially when we think about the more assessments of more of a physical function, are videos and non-written, like sort of non-transcript or non-paper based or ECTD based data considered, and how valuable is that, especially in a rare disease when we're trying to explain why maybe a certain performance outcome assessment was chosen as an efficacy endpoint? Is it helpful or is it not? Is it reviewed? Is it not?
I get started. The answer to the last question, is it reviewed? Definitely. Is it helpful? Definitely. But again, it depends on the rigor of the, it's very context-based, right? But also the rigor and the quality of that data. But we do have examples that in our center, that we in our office, we have heavily relied on those outcomes, and yeah, definitely. And our review memo is very transparent, that we encourage to include a discussion of our assessment, so of each of these data that has been submitted and reviewed. So the limitations and how we used on it, how we used the data, or how much we relied on it. It's we tried to be very detailed in our memo.
Great, thank you so much, Rosa. Okay, I'll move on with some more questions that we have. Can the speakers clarify, can the panelists clarify the difference between patient experience data that is used as scientific evidence versus patient engagement? There is a confusion within organizations about whether patient engagement initiatives, and I think they're talking about that early qualitative collection of patient experience data, whether that can be used as scientific evidence to inform regulatory decision making.
I can start with this one. I think this is kind of a conversation, Fujita, we've had in the past around the difference between, insights and evidence. And the idea that patient engagement is, in any ways, it's the strategy, it's the beginning step to really seek to understand that lived experience of the patient, which starts very early on, and then to help, to a point you made, David, direct the direction of your clinical development program, because you can go in and even have, information and literature from clinicians who have said, we think this matters, this symptom, this measurement matters, this tool is what works. And when you actually go and talk to the patients, they're like, actually, that doesn't bother us. We can deal with that. We really want this to be targeted. And then as industry, you say like, all right, that sounds like it's a gap. Do we have tools? Like, what is the evidence that we have that addresses that gap? Do we have different tools, as they mentioned, like digital health technologies, rural data that can help support addressing that? And if there isn't evidence already, then that's where that patient engagement and the relationship may change to, let's design a qualitative study or some other mixed approach that can help us collect the evidence that we would then need to submit. So it is a continuum. It's where that relationship with our patient advocacy or groups and patient groups are so critical to start very early, so that you continue to come and have that ongoing conversation about measuring what matters, and then designing, that through the engagement strategy, determining what evidence you need to gather or either point to or develop because there's a gap.
Thanks, Leslie. Any other comments? Yeah.
Yeah, I would just say I agree, and I am, and not to sound like the FDA, but I think it really depends, right, on kind of why you're collecting the data, what you're calling patient engagement, because sometimes it is scientific in that it informs clinical trial design or it informs study design. So while it may not be in and of itself, I think, a piece of scientific data that points to efficacy, it may explain why we have a certain schedule of assessments, or why we are setting up a clinical trial with a visit schedule a certain way. And I think it can be really helpful. I think it's also important to remember that relationship with patient advocacy organizations is very valuable, but it's not the same as having done more broad qualitative research. Professional patient advocates or patients who have the time to be a part of an advocacy organization are not necessarily representative of the full population of patients. So it's really important not to consider that voice as fully the voice of an entire population of patients. So that I hear that tension sometimes within companies, where it seems like it'd be really efficient, like, let's just go to the patient advocacy organization, we can get all of the data we need. I think we're missing out when we do that sometimes.
Thank you, Nikki. Before I move on, any thoughts from the FDA? John, I can.
Maybe just go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Lisa.
You first, David.
Okay, then quickly then. I was just going to say a good example, I think, that's in this space, and I agree, it depends on how you define it. I've worked in development during my career. So, my focus is maybe more with the COA team than the other parts of the organization. But survey work is much like this. So you could do survey work without confirmation of the indication, and you may collect variables and have a data strategy that gives you confidence in those data. And so that, again, very hypothesis generating might lead you to a COA strategy. You decide that there's an important aspect of the profile of your product that needs to be brought out in clinical research. You learn that talking to patients through a survey platform, or you engage a particular patient advocacy group, and I've done that in the past, and it's really brought out aspects of the product profile that other stakeholders didn't recognize. But again, that is the first layer that sort of guides you to the more controlled data. And so I think that it's got value, but that doesn't mean in of itself that it's necessarily part of the regulatory decision making. It sets you up for success because you're informed. You know that heart rates or tremor are important to patients in the context of this particular drug class.
Great, thank you, Elisa. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and my comment is just a very minor one, but just did want to emphasize that the importance of patient engagement throughout the drug development process. But just again, to emphasize that, it's important, and it doesn't need to be part of the scientific evidence necessarily. I mean, regardless, this is critical for the design of these development programs. Even if it never rises to the level where it's going to come in to us in a formal NDA submission, where you highlight it as a critical piece of, sort of how we should think about your application.
Thank you. And I think what I'm hearing, from the very beginning is, talk to the FDA. If you are collecting and you have this data, reach out to the FDA and ask if that can be part of the submission package, or however you're planning to use it. It's just having that transparent communication with the agency is critical. Okay. I'll move on to perhaps maybe one final question here. So this is a question about, it has been mentioned that it is not always clear to review teams how the sponsor intends the patient experience data to be used or considered. What's FDA's current process for seeking clarity from sponsors to signal a lack of understanding and making sure that the data submitted is being considered to inform regulatory decision making? So is there that sort of feedback loop? I think that's what this commenter is getting at, to kind of try to get further details or clarity from sponsors when things are unclear.
Rosie, you go first.
Sure. So I'll just mention, like, the first to go tool would be information requests. So we directly ask, please provide your rationale or assessment of this data that's been submitted. So and then we go from there if needed. It could be a form in the context of an informal or formal meeting, but the first step is just we ask.
And maybe I'll just say that, if this is a critical piece of the application, we're probably going to have had, discussions before the submission came in about, the level of rigor with which it was collected and how it should be submitted. I think there's a whole bunch of other patient experience data that gets put in, and we're told it's put in, or we're not told it's put in. And frankly, I don't think we necessarily circle back to a sponsor and say, hey, why'd you give us this, right? I don't think we systematically do that. But I think it speaks to the larger issue here is when you send this to us, tell us that you sent it to us and why you think it's important. Why is it important specifically for an FDA decision making? And again, some of this gets to, I think, also the reality is that you're not just collecting these data for us, you're collecting it for other audiences as well. And so, it's just important that you're very transparent when you come in about how it is intended to shape our thinking.
Thank you so much. So I recognize that we stand between lunch, folks getting lunch. So I do want to start wrapping up our panel discussion. We've had a great discussion so far. I would like to turn it just for final thoughts from all of our panelists to end this panel discussion regarding, we've talked about submission of patient experience data, review of submission, patient experience data, and some of the challenges. And I'd like to end with just final thoughts. I'll just go down the list the way that I see it, and ask folks to give a few words regarding this. So I'll start with Leslie.
Thank you. So this has been a great discussion. I think what it has also opened up for me is the value of continuing this type of learning, that it's not always something that is that individual discussion as a sponsor with the FDA review team of how we do this or that, but it is amplifying that and an ongoing dialogue that is needed, not just, a once or twice a year workshop, but how do we really advance the space? How do we engage patients to say, what is burdensome? Is a colonoscopy too much? Then what is the right way to measure that disease? How do we get FDA on board? There's entire strategies, I think, that we have opportunities to change going forward, and the best way to do that. So hopefully this ends up with ongoing dialogue between all stakeholders here. And at the end of the day, I'd also like to see that collaboration between industry and FDA about what a framework or a template for how we tell that story to you about the data we're submitting as well. So thanks for a great discussion today.
Thanks, Leslie. Eliza?
Oh dear. Well, I'll just say that I've been at FDA for maybe, I think it's about 17 years now. And when I first came, I think there really was this, beginning emphasis on patient-focused drug development, right? Ensuring that we incorporate the patient voice in drug development, which obviously is something we should always do. But I think sort of we, as sort of a larger community, lost track of that. And so I think it's just exciting to see how far we have come. But obviously, workshops like this are an excellent opportunity to talk about where we need to go and how we can do this better. But I do just want to say that I think we have certainly come a long way in the last, 20 years or so in terms of incorporating, hopefully, the patient voice in drug development and regulatory decision making.
Thank you. Rosa?
As it was discussed several times, being intentional and planning proactive and having that dialogue early on and throughout the program development.
Thanks, Rosa. And Nikki?
Yeah, thanks. I'll echo. I think this has been a really great discussion. And we have come a really long way. I mean, when I think about 2006 and 2009 with the first PRO guidance, and we have a lot more flexibility now with how we're collecting these data, how these data are being used, a lot more familiarity with the methods, but with flexibility sometimes comes lack of clarity on exactly what good looks like. So the more examples that we can share, I think the better off of what good looks like, the better off we'll all be. And then internally, from a sponsor perspective, the details really matter and the operation matters. And I think taking the time as part of a submission and really being mindful and intentional about what the delivery looks like and what the package looks like is worth the time during that process.
Thanks, Nikki. Monica?
Thanks. So we've heard a lot about how patient experience data is collected in a lot of different ways. And again, throughout the really life cycle of product development, even before clinical trials begin. And I think that really works to emphasize how important it is to have collaboration and to engage early and often with the agency so we can discuss what to do with all of this data that's being collected and how best to use it to inform how to help patients. In terms of submissions and how we've been talking about having a lot of clarity in what sponsors submit in a final application, I would just like to echo some advice that I was given early on when writing any sort of complex paper, which is tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you already told them. I think really cannot be explicit enough in these sorts of things. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. So we can just keep on reiterating throughout the document and flagging it for you. And finally, David.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd just like to comment on my experience a little bit. So on how rich and informative patient experience data are, and how I'm always surprised, and how that informs our thinking. And I think, obviously I have the most visibility to clinical outcome assessments. We have patient populations where stability is the treatment goal. We have patient populations where there's a specific level of functioning that is important. No matter where you start, that's where you need to go. And so, learning those lessons through the contributions from the patients who are supporting this research is really important to us. And I just always find it engaging. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, David. So finally, thank you all for an engaging and informative discussion. We covered considerations on how sponsors should submit PED, what FDA would like to see from sponsors, the challenges that you face in reviewing and submitting the submitted PED, and considerations around that have really highlighted that need for transparency, communication, the need for level of rigor, the quality of data that we're submitting, and overall just that communication between sponsors and FDA and how we're considering patient experience data in our decision making, and then how that is further communicated back out to patient stakeholders and others. We do need to, I think it's a theme that we heard, we do need to continue to collaborate, work together to really emphasize the importance of patient experience data, that patient voice, and seek solutions to build on and further enhance this PFDD foundation that was set many years ago now. So with that, I'd like to thank the panelists, and I hope you all have a great lunch for those who are about to have lunch. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for really taking the time to share your thoughts and just having this rich and robust discussion. We are now going to be breaking for lunch, so please be back at 12:45 p.m. Eastern.